Since Jesus is, as John puts it, the Word, with God in the beginning, the one without whom nothing was made that has been made, how do we, as his disciples, make sure that we keep our handle on reality? The passage that we'll be looking at this week and next is Colossians chapter 2 verse 6 up to chapter 4 verse 6. And Colossians 2, 6 and 7 gives us a very precise summary. From it we can derive three questions that will help us to see if we're keeping or losing our grip on reality. First question is, where do my roots currently lie? Second question is, where am I getting my energy from? And the last question is, what is the output of my life today? If the answers are Jesus, Jesus and overflowing thankfulness, then I'm in touch with reality. If not, I'm losing my grip. Unfortunately, Paul knows it is not uncommon for us to lose direction in life and for our roots to go in many other directions than Jesus, and for what passes for energy in us to come from everywhere but him, and for our output to be anything but overflowing thankfulness. If that's the case, then the first thing Paul has us do is to think about where we are now getting our handle on reality. There are plenty of available candidates which he characterises, in verse 8 this is, as hollow and deceptive philosophy, depending on human tradition and the basic principles of this world. And here's the important point, rather than on Christ. So the general approach that we get here is for us to ask ourselves, what are you kidding? Choosing this over Jesus? Because Jesus is not hollow or deceptive, of course, he's full. All the fullness of the deity in bodily form, verse 9. And his followers are given that fullness in him, verse 10. He is the head over every power and authority, whereas those hollow and deceptive philosophies derive from those powers and authorities. Instead of a circumcision that depends on human tradition, we have the real thing, a radical separation from sin done for us by Jesus when we were buried with him in baptism and raised to new life in him. In verses 13 to 15 there are allusions to two customs which were in common use at the time Paul was writing. One was a written notice of debt which was held by the creditor and could be used against the debtor. We still have something very similar. Of course, once the debt is paid in full, that piece of paper becomes worthless. Point being, Jesus has paid the debt in full. The written code that stood opposed to us is nailed to the cross, taken away. By putting down roots into a deceptive philosophy, we're breathing new life into a dead letter. Why would you? Second custom was the one where Caesar's captives would be stripped and led behind him in his processional triumph, thus effectively demonstrating to all of Rome and anyone else who was interested that these powers that had dared to challenge Caesar were phony, totally out of touch with reality. Analogies being made with the cross again. That's what happened to the powers that be in the death and resurrection of Jesus. See verse 15. Now the very last thing anyone would do if they were watching Caesar's triumph in Rome would be to start following one of those captives. Not least because they most probably only had hours to live. Again, the message for Christians whose roots are wandering off. Are you kidding? So what? Well, to start with, there are two things to watch out for. Two ways in which these hollow and deceptive philosophies can get channeled into our lives very easily. One is that people judge us. They judge us by whether or not we're following those philosophies. And Paul's instruction is not to let them do so, by which I take him to mean that we don't do what they say for fear of being judged. You usually can't stop people judging. But the second thing to watch out for is getting over-impressed by super-spiritual people. We all know the sort. The whole point is that they've got something that marks them out from the crowd, from the run-of-the-mill Christians around them, and makes them impressive people to follow. Or not, as far as Paul is concerned. It may sell paperbacks and fill conference halls, but the real thing that marks them out from the crowd is that they've lost contact with the head and with the body. Don't do likewise. Don't put a set of man-made rules in place of a relationship with Jesus. For all they may seem to have lasting value, compared to Jesus, we might as well be building on air. If you have been, thank you for listening.